All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, right now we've got standards and requirements, and um, the requirements can then reference a standard. I think last time we talked about signing a particular standard. So like, if you're creating like internal policy, for example, you could then sign that in its entirety. Likewise, if you're like, OWASP, ASVS or something, right? You could create your own requirements for ASVS and then sign that document.
Yeah, and I think we were going back and forth on that one. I don't think we had a concrete decision there yet. I think folks were still
Right.
going to mull it over as should it be required? Should it be optional? Should we have it at all? My take
Yeah.
was more along the lines of we should at least do something like a cryptographic checksum of some kind or another, just so that we know that it's what we're expecting, so that we can validate the document against something. In
Right.
case the site was compromised or something was changed without our knowing. So that was one thought. But I believe that Jeff and a couple of others were saying that yeah, maybe not, maybe that's not so necessary in this instance, because we're talking about specific pieces of the standard and things like that. So I don't think we came up with a concrete conclusion one way or another on that one yet.
So I think let me just kind of say what we have in CycloneDX today. So um, we have we have attestations as a external reference. We can very easily add um, standards or something like that as well. And then for every external reference, so an external reference is basically a way that CycloneDX establishes relationships. There's like, I don't know, 30 or more different types of relationships that we support. And it's external from usually the component or service that it's referencing. So it could be something in the bomb itself, like pointing to a different bomb ref in the same bomb, or it could be pointing like to a URL, right? And in the case of pointing to a URL or some other kind of file, we can describe what the hash values are. So that capability already exists. So for example, if we have an attestations, we've got a bunch of attestations and they reference a particular standard, we could have an external reference for that standard and then supply the hash values for that. So if it's changed, we
Yeah,
would know. So
that's
that
perfect.
capability is already kind of part of Cyclone today.
Yeah, and I think that that's perfectly fine
Yeah,
for the most part, because that's the thing we care most about is the content, right?
right,
If it's the signed published release version that we care about, and we should be linking to that, and I think a checksum is fine and it keeps things simple.
right. Okay, fair enough. Um,
I guess what follow on with that? We were talking some about like signing envelopes. Like, are we looking at signing just the standards by itself, or the standards plus requirements get signed as a set?
I think the attestation is saying that you are attesting to this standard with this version or this SHA check, right?
Yeah,
So
I'm
I
not even
think
thinking
that
attestations though. I'm saying like, right, because in CycloneDX there is signing of portions of the document.
right,
So we were talking at one point about moving requirements under standards. Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
would you still sign this? Would you sign standards then?
yeah, theoretically,
Okay.
right. So then we could have, so within the standard, you could have all the requirements for the standard. You could just get rid of this line. And then for this standard, you could have the signature object, right, which is a standard JSON signature format, right? So that would be perfectly viable. Use JSF right there.
Okay. Yeah. No. Cool. That answers my question. Thanks.
Okay. But that, you know, he brings up a good point. I mean, I don't think, does it make sense to have, I mean, this would be easy, right? To kind of group the requirements to a given standard. That way you could just sign the entire thing. If you didn't do that, then you'd basically have to sign the standard and then every single individual requirement that was part of that standard in order to be able to sign the entire thing. That sounds like a lot of signing to me.
Well, you would sign the standard as a whole with all of the requirements in it. That would be one signature, right?
And this would be the way to do that. If you had them separately, like we have standards up here and requirements down here, you'd have to do them individually.
Yeah.
Because, yeah. So maybe it's good that we are moving requirements under standards. Is everyone kind of agreement with that line of thinking?
Yeah, and I'm not sure about the noun standards because that kind of implies
Yes.
a government standard or an industry standard. I think we just need to be clear that standards can also be internal standards or internal policies that you're trying to abide by.
I'm glad you brought that up because I've been contemplating the exact same thing, and I've consulted the thesaurus.com, and it was not overly helpful.
Yeah, I think that's one of those where in the documentation for this, right? That's one of those things where we call out standards are explicitly intended to be both external and internal, right?
Right.
And I think that what Jeff was mentioning before is there's tremendous value in the idea of machine readable standards for things like NIST 800 and such, because then we can do things like mapping back and forth very, very easily, right? That's the OpenCRE link that we talked about last time.
I'm kind of curious in your mind, what is the difference between a standard versus a specification? I tend to think of them as the same. I tend to use specifications if I'm talking internally. I use standards if I'm thinking an external standard.
Yeah, I just don't think we want to overload the nouns too much here, or use too many different nouns, right? Do we want a standards and a specifications thing when they both are functionally doing the same thing? You know, that's where I think that let's just pick one and keep it in here. And then I guess looking at this, like something that's kind of that I always like to have that's missing is a description for the standard. Usually having that in there is a good field. And then what's the difference between source and URL? Oh yeah, good call on version.
Yeah, like ASVS, for example, has different versions of the standard, right? PCI DSS, same thing.
So source is, yeah, source is generically named, I think. Like, what are we trying to get at with it?
Who's the author?
So should we say, you know, author or originator or something instead of source? Because source, like when I first looked through this, I'm like, well, what's the difference between source and URL, right?
Right, okay. Yeah, we could use author,
source organization. Like if we wanted to like first tier support, whether it was an internal or an external thing, you know, that might be something useful in there. Source organization, because that could then be external or internal. It would be fairly clear, I think, whether it was one of your departments internally or, you know, an external one.
right.
Or maybe a better way to, I don't know. Let me float this by you guys. An owning organization, or who owns the policy, who owns the standard. You know, standard owner might be a better concept. I don't know.
Who owns the standard?
Because it could be your internal group owns it, right? Or your company owns this standard because it's an internal policy. It could be, in this case, the Office of Management and Budget owns it. Like,
right.
Who's actually setting it? That would be another thought. Like, you know, standard setter. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure if short source is the right term or not.
That's shorter.
Yeah.
Owner.
Maybe we keep it like this and we put it out for when we put it out for comments, you know, that's something that we pay attention to.
Right. Okay. All right. No, this all makes sense.
Steve, on the URL, is that something you're gonna switch over to a bottom ref, or is that something you still want to leave at the top level URL?
No, this is just the URL to the standard itself.
Okay, so you want to
Yeah.
call it out explicitly versus encourage a bomb ref?
Yeah, no, the bomb ref is just the identifier
Sorry.
within the bomb itself.
I meant the external ref
Oh,
of URL type.
yeah, I mean,
I want to know if that was a conscious choice.
yeah, it was. I mean, technically, we could use an external reference of type documentation, or we could create an external reference type of standard, right? We could do these things. Or we could have, I mean, now that we actually talked about the use case of for attestations actually referencing a standard and then using the hashes for that, maybe we want to be consistent, right? Okay, we will be consistent. Okay.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of this because from an implementation perspective, right, you could have the HTML version of this be human readable. You could have the JSON representation of it be this requirement doc, right? And then people could pull that in very readily at that point.
Right.
And map their attestations directly to it very cleanly.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to capture like the published date and that sort of thing? Or no? Is that just too much information that if you wanted to find out, you can find out?
I think the version is sufficient.
Version. Okay. Yeah, I mean, sometimes the version will actually be like an actual version number. Sometimes it might be a date. Sometimes it just might be empty.
And that's okay. I think that's okay because we want to
Yeah.
say that we are attesting that we meet this version of this document. If we need to upgrade it, then we need to redo things because there's usually substantial change between the versions.
Right. And one thing that we can do in terms of like, I know we're talking about documents. One thing that that I've been kind of toying with is the idea. So we've got in CycloneDX, we've got a property taxonomy, and within that taxonomy, we've got, you know, organizations have registered their own namespace like GitLab and, you know, Sonatype and IBM and all these others have kind of registered their own top level thing. I was thinking about actually registering one specific for Dublin Core. That way, when it comes to documents, you can use all of Dublin Core already within the context of CycloneDX, which would be really interesting, actually. That way, you wouldn't have to recreate the wheel in terms of things like, you know, authorship and things like that.
I'm not sure I understand that.
So, like, there's properties in Dublin Core for published date and all kinds of other things. So you could theoretically.
What I'm missing is like,
all...
what is Dublin for? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it's a it was a taxonomy. It's actually it's not IETF. It is a formal taxonomy. It's a formal standard that describes, I don't know, maybe 80 or so different types of properties for a document. It's generalized, its general purpose is for like books and blogs and like that sort of thing, which standards kind of fall into, right? They kind of fall into this category of things that you could theoretically describe using Dublin Core.
And what's that actually called? Can you spell that?
Dublin, Dublin, Core, Core.
Oh, core. Okay.
Yeah.
I actually have heard of this one. I just was, for some reason, it sounded like it was 4. My speakers were not being too handy today.
No worries.
I haven't used this much at all, though.
Yeah, I used to use it a lot, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. It's grown since then. I looked at it a few weeks ago, actually, and there's some things that we can potentially pull out in terms of supporting different kind of elements for documents without having to recreate the wheel. So,
And where would you see us using this? This is basically like metadata for the documents.
It is. So you can theoretically use that in CycloneDX properties. All we would have to do is register a top level name for Dublin Core. So that way you could do that, and then all of a sudden anybody could actually start using that namespace. So given the fact that standards kind of fall into that same kind of realm where Dublin Core actually was intended to describe things that are written, things like blogs and books and that sort of thing, it might make sense to kind of use some of that for things that we might want to add in the future.
I don't know enough to have an opinion on this one. It sounds good in theory. Are we competing with our own pieces in here? Like, does Dublin Core have a description field or
Yeah,
an owner
it has
field that
all
we're going to
those.
be? Yeah. So
It
are
has all
we?
those.
So are we competing then with it and saying then that there needs to be duplication?
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, but yeah, it actually has all those fields already. But we'll leave author out for the time being, and hopefully we can get some feedback on owner. Is there anything in so if we're going to do the same thing for, so okay, we said we were going to use external references for URL for the standard. What about for the requirement itself?
I would agree. It's an obvious consistency that we'd want to have.
Okay. We can do that.
Well, for the individual requirement, do we really need a URL or an external reference at all? We're saying that this entire standard is an external reference.
You are, but like if the standard itself was like, we were talking about Markdown before we started the recording, right? If there was a dedicated web page specific for the requirement, you could theoretically link out to that specific requirement. So all external references are optional, so they don't have to be there. But the fact that they can be there might be convenient.
Yeah, I guess I kind of envisioned this more that it would be one static thing that you're calling, and then there'd be like a line reference or something like that. But I see what you mean.
So we've got the bomb ref for the standard. We've got a bomb ref, an identifier for the or a bomb ref for the requirement. We have a identifier, which is the identifier of the requirement in the context of the standard. So what is it called in the context of the standard? We've got the text of that requirement, URL to OpenCRE. We're establishing parent-child relationships of requirements, and then external references optionally. Is there anything that we're missing?
Not that I can think of right now. I think a lot will come out when we try to, do a mock of this with a standard or with part of a standard. I think we'll see like, oh, wait, maybe we should add this or maybe we should add that.
Right. So one thing that, I'm thinking of like ASVS, for example. If you're not familiar with ASVS, use Salsa because it's basically the same thing. So you've got a laundry list of things, and then you have different levels for those things. Now the levels don't necessarily align to the identifier in the standard, right? So like I might have item number 1, and it might be like a level 1 behavior, and item level 2 might be like a level 3 behavior, right? So that would be an extra piece of data that would be really useful. I just don't know what to call it. Again, we're back to the noun question.
Well, if we want to try hatching it out here, we could just go below 38 there and just say for now levels or tiers or noun of choice. And I wouldn't put it in the requirements themselves because this is a mapping of what requirements go to what level, right? If it's like the salsa, it would be this I need all of these requirements to meet level 1. I need these requirements to meet level 2, these to meet level 3, etc. Right. So it's something that goes at the same level as requirements. So down there would be a separate thing. It would be whatever the noun is for now levels would work. And honestly, I would see this as a very simple object of, a bomb ref for whatever the level is, probably the identifier or name of the level, a description for it, and then an array of requirements to meet that level.
All right, hold on. Let me see if I can capture your train of thought. So you've got an object. You said it had a description though.
Yeah, because if it's salsa level 2, what is salsa level 2?
I see.
Right.
You're
You want to
describing the
know
level
what
itself.
Yeah, the level itself, a description for the level itself, and then some kind of an identifier for that level, a name and a bomb ref, that kind of combination. Because we might want to refer to this someplace else in the document. I don't know if we would or wouldn't, but
Right. Okay.
and then below that would be like an array of requirements to meet the level there.
I'm a simpleton thinking through this. Is this necessary though, right? Or are those really just different standards?
Well, that's an interesting point because I think you could say salsa level 1 as the standard itself and just
Yeah,
list
that's
the
simply what-
requirements for that. Right. And then salsa level 2 and list the additional requirements for that. So you could absolutely do it that way. The thing is, though, that salsa as a standard is written to have multiple levels already. So, if we wanted to map it cleanly to the way that they have it, we would do something like this. But
Yeah,
I'm not
and
sold this
all
is the best way.
Yeah, no, that's fine. All the OWASP standards, like the
Mhm.
ASVS, MASVS, SCVS, etc., they're all written the same way and have been written this way for years. Being able to, so I guarantee you that, like, at least in the OWASP community, I don't think we're going to have different documents for each of the levels. That's not what we're going to do. We would probably
Sure.
have a single document with, containing everything.
I guess I'm looking at it from maybe more like an attestation perspective, right? So I have my attestations that are going to tie back to requirements. They're going to be tied back to levels. So some portion of requirements are not going to be met as part of my attestations, right?
Right.
And that's the part where it's kind of like when I go, I guess I'm looking at it from like, I'm going to bring a body of evidence. I'm going to have a list of requirements that are not met because I'm at a different level. And what does that story tell to an assessor and auditor who's not well versed in that standard?
I mean, it
Well,
says that you're working towards that level, but you haven't
right.
reached it yet.
Yeah.
So our attestations don't actually, I mean, they're attestations for the requirements themselves, not for the levels. And I think if we keep it that way, I think we'll be fine.
Yeah,
Because I don't think we should be attesting to the levels.
right, but we'd be able to infer that based on this path, right? So we know we meet
Correct.
requirements X, Y, and Z. Are we at level 1 or level 2?
Right.
And
Okay. Yeah.
from my perspective, that's very valuable to have, because specifically, like, I'm trying to move on a journey to salsa level 4 in the end. I can see how far I've gotten. I can literally just, do a put it up on a grid and see based
Right.
on this. And that's huge.
Right.
So maybe opening a can of worms here. What about, I'll say waivers, but like discrepancies between a standard and what is approved discrepancies, right? So for example, internally, I might have like FIPS compliance, but for a specific project, I have a waiver by my security folks that are signed off.
That would
When
probably,
Wouldn't
Yeah,
that go in the mitigation strategy though? I mean, if you're waiving something, you have to kind of usually explain why
Mhm.
and how
Okay.
you're going to fix it.
Then
yeah,
is
I
that,
think
I'm
that's a
sorry,
really
is
good call out.
that mitigation strategy?
waivers-
What is that tied to? What,
Well, right
how's that being tied back?
It's all part of the single attestation. So this is the attestation, which has the assessor, the mapping, and then the confidence of this particular attestation. So if we have a confidence of 1 and we have like 0 mappings, that actually tells us that we're not meeting the standard, right? And you could put a mitigation strategy. Now that right now we just have a string, but I mean, should it be more?
Actually, I
Yes,
think that
the question becomes who's going to be the one to sign off on it, right? So if the signature block is on the standard, I would expect the person, or maybe not the state. See, this is tough.
Well,
It's not a
each
standard is going to sign off.
Each attestation also has its own signature. So if you have a legal department, for example, signing off on something on one part of the standard and a security department signing off on another part of the standard, that would be completely viable.
Yep,
yeah, and
I'm on board. Okay.
what I might suggest though is in this mapping where we're doing, hey, for this requirement, these are our claims. If we're not meeting something, if we're not meeting the requirement, shouldn't it be in that mapping, not out there? Because I think that the way that this is going right now, we're going to have a lot of these objects then, versus if we had the confidence block as part of that map, how confident are we in this particular claim? Then we can, look at the evidence or have a mitigation strategy in there. Like all of that could be within this mapping.
So you're talking about there.
Something like that, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. I think we talked about that previously, and I don't think we concluded on anything. I think we just kind of brought it up.
Because otherwise what's going to happen is people are going to need to have can you scroll up a little bit? Where
Yeah.
are we in here? Which actual the attestation? So we're going to have like a dozen attestation objects per requirement here, or not per requirement, sorry, my nouns, per standard here, right? But if we allowed for each of the claims within this map to be individually signed or individually commented on or mitigated, we really only need the one attestation as a whole.
That is true. That is true.
So I would think that that's preferable, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't,
you can have
I don't know.
multiples, but yeah, if you wanted the option to have one, you could. Yeah. Okay.
I'm trying to think from an actual like implementation perspective. If I'm generating the evidence, right, then somebody's going to need to do a review of that. And people are probably going to, is it reasonable to assume, let me ask it as a question, that people, as they're trying to do the attestations, are going to be reviewing these things in chunks and then want to sign off in it in chunks, basically. And I think that that is reasonable. And if that's reasonable, then, well, we could do it either way then. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at SSDF, right, there's a lot of different requirements that are part of SSDF, and the form basically has a signature, right? CEO or whatever, but it's one signature, and you're signing for the entire thing. And I think if we want a machine readable format, I think we also need to capture that use case. Because even though this is machine readable, I think the initial implementations are going to be human driven.
Right. But that's the whole document as a whole.
Right.
Right. That's me saying that all of my attestations are meeting these standards or this standard, and I'm signing the entire document saying that as an organization. What we're talking about here is the internal process, not the external scenario. We're talking about the internal scenario of my internal auditor or my external auditor is going through, looking at my claims, right? Looking at the evidence and saying, yes, they meet the requirement, or no, they don't meet the requirement, and here's the mitigation strategy.
Right.
And
Okay.
I do think that we actually could have that in either representation here. I don't know if one way is better or the other.
I like having the confidence as part of the claim. I think that's kind of how Jeff had it laid out previously, if I remember right. It's been a while. Not sure where we broke it up, but it makes sense for it to be part of the claim. Now, in terms of mitigation strategy, I mean, right now it's just a blob of text.
Yeah, I think it actually, in this instance, I think it actually makes a good amount of sense for it to be a blob of text.
Okay.
Because now if it's in here, right, it's much more narrowly scoped to just this particular claim, right, which is it's a claim to map to a requirement, right? So this to me makes more sense to have this just be like free-form text.
Okay. Do we want to add other things in there, like when do we think we're going to be able to get it done, or can that be described in text?
Do we care when the mitigation is going to be complete in a point in time document? Because that to me sounds like an external commitment, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to have in here.
That's why I asked the question. Because I don't know either. Now we use this particular noun in our ML support, and it's a text field, but we use it in our ML support in 1.5, where we're describing like fairness assessments and biases and stuff like that, ethical considerations. So if you have like an ethical consideration, environmental impact, for example, what is your mitigation strategy, right? And it's just a free form text. We could continue that route here, or we could come up with another noun, wave something or other, I don't know, and make it an object and provide a bunch more data. I don't know if that's useful or not.
The thing that might be useful, but I think evidence covers it, is like a link out to where you talk about what that mitigation strategy is, or the implementation of that mitigation maybe. But could that just be another piece of evidence, like, hey, this is the mitigation strategy, right, in Jira, or this is the ticket that's tracking that mitigation strategy. Because right here in line 105, if you're down, right, it's evidence. We've got observation, test result, metric, sampling, anecdote.
Right.
If there's a mitigation strategy, is that a piece of evidence by itself? Yes, we have evidence there's a mitigation strategy. Yes, there's evidence that this is being mitigated or in the process of it. And then we also have the created and expiring dates there as part of it.
Right. So
Or is that
Yeah.
overloading evidence too much?
I think from a machine readable perspective, right? Like, oh, I'm going to go look at policy and I'm going to say, here's my requirements and I want to see evidence for everything, right? And suddenly you're going to see one that doesn't have one, right? Is that how do you know if the, and I like the idea of having, if you have a waiver in place, that's evidence. And as part of that, you would have the mitigation strategy documented as evidence. Because if I'm going to want to traverse a tree and I want to make sure that there's an evidence leaf on everything, to me, that makes sense to be able to do it that way. I'm not going to, in a machine readable point, I'm not going to know what a mitigation strategy is.
So let's see here. I've got two different parts of this document that I've got the new part and the old part. Let's see, this is the declaration standards, attestations, okay. And then
we had separate claims and separate evidence so that we could link everything together in the attestation.
right, claims and then evidence, okay. And then this part of the document is old. This is some original stuff. I'll get rid of that. Okay.
Yeah, so in this format, if we wanted to talk about a piece of evidence being a mitigation strategy or a mitigation, then 105, we would just add mitigation in there.
We would add mitigation where?
Line 105.
Oh,
type
okay, I
field.
see. Right.
I like that a lot because it's going to be machine readable. It's easy to find that this is a mitigation claim or mitigation evidence. I can find all those. I can track them down.
Yeah,
Right.
and this has the description. It has the URL, authors and reviewers. So you can say, yes, we reviewed the mitigation strategy, right? This does have a lot of valuable metadata for that particular thing.
Yeah, Derek, I really like that a lot.
So in CycloneDX, we have in 1.5, we have this concept of a data component. And data components can be anything from configuration to source code to a data set. So pretty much anything we want it to be. So we could theoretically have that in there because it also has, for example, data governance. So we've got the owners, the stewards. Who else am I missing? There's one more role. Data governance, data stewards. All right, the owners, stewards, and I can't remember. Anyway, there's more information in there. Maybe that would be useful.
I guess the question is, do we want this document to be able to be given to somebody else, an auditor, for example, and literally have every single piece of data that they need to make the decision in the document itself? So
right.
A screenshot, because like that's the type of thing that, you know, we have to supply as evidence a lot of the time is screenshots.
And
do
I
we really
think
want a
for,
base 64 encoded image in this file? Or do we want to link out to a base?
Well,
to the
Cyclone
image?
already supports it because we need to support it for like proof of concepts and this sort of thing, where the evidence should not be publicly accessible. So we inline a lot of attachments and stuff like that. So we already support this use case. Now, you could theoretically, you could using the data element, you have a choice of whether you want to reference it via URL or attach it in line. So you actually have the choice, because like in ML, there's no way you would, attach, terabytes of, training data. It's not going to happen. But, if you have a screenshot of something or payload or, whatever, and it's sensitive, yeah, you absolutely would. And that would actually, if we did that, that would get rid of the URL aspect because it would no longer be a thing, because we could capture that in the data. And if the evidence had governance things on it, we would be able to support that as well, just out of the box.
Question on the reviewer piece in here under the evidence, is that something where we would want to support just, you know, the name in an email ref format, or is that something where we might want to have an optional signature field in there?
That's a good point. A good point. What I was thinking for author and reviewer, you don't know if this is going to be an entity or like an organization or an individual. So in most of CycloneDX, where you have like a field that could be either one, we basically support what's called an organizational entity or an organizational contact. So it could be either one of those things. And then if it is an organizational entity, you can actually have multiple contacts within that entity too. So
On here, what's the difference between an artifact versus the data?
what's the difference between what?
Sorry, on evidence here, you have artifact. Is that effectively what you're kind of you're including
I
as
think
evidence?
so. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to
So
keep
if
the
we-
noun standard with the rest of the CycloneDX world, we can just call it data, but then we, in the documentation, again, we say the actual artifact or a reference to the artifact.
Right. Okay. That's fine. Let's revisit this. Do we need parent-child claims? I mean, if we
I still don't think we do, because if you go up to the mapping, that's where we've got everything mapped back and forth. I think claims are independent. And if we have multiple claims that support a standard, right, or a part of a standard or a requirement, sorry, that's the right noun. If we have a claim, it maps to one standard or it's supporting multiple pieces of a standard, right? So I don't think it ever will need a sub. Is there a need for a parent-child relationship in a claim? And this was one where I think Jeff really did think that there needed to be multiple, or there needed to be a hierarchy here, but I think that we moved the hierarchy up to requirements where it absolutely needs to be, because there's absolutely a hierarchy of requirements.
Yeah.
And the claims are kind of more, you know, standalone at that point.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we need it either.
And the other thing I'd throw out there along the same lines is, do we really need conformance in here if we have the score and the mitigation up top? Maybe we do need it here because this is where a person who's making the claim would say we're compliant 80–90% of the time. But if we've got up here the claim with the confidence, what's the difference between confidence up here and conformance down there?
Right. Well, again, I copied it basically verbatim. So if we don't think let's see, this was.
I think it's better up in the attestation than down in the claim. So here where you have it on line 76, I think is the better place for it to be. Versus down below in the claim, everybody's always going to say, oh no, we are 100% compliant with this.
Yeah, I think if we change this noun, maybe like we are, well, no, that's different. This is confidence. And this is saying how much we are meeting a given requirement. So this is different. Like, again, I'll go back to the, do you educate, all your developers yearly for security? If I educate most of my developers, 80% of them, that would be my conformance to that standard, right? And I'm 100% confident with that.
Okay.
So is this the right, so I think they're both needed, but is this the right place for it?
Yeah, because if it's going to be for the, I guess it depends on if the requirement is, do you train all of your developers? My conformance with that requirement is 80% in that instance, right? It's not that I'm, or is it that I'm claiming 80% conformance? And if I have, let me throw this around. If we've got we do not have a map of claims. We are making one claim with a supporting list of evidence. So yeah, I think this would work fine.
Okay.
Well, how would
'Cause
it roll up? If I have requirement 1 and I have multiple claims to support that, but the claims have different conformance values, do I care? Does that need to roll up? Or should that be at the claim level?
Right.
Or at the that map level? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Like basically here.
Yeah, but even if we moved it up to here, if the requirement again is I have 80, that I have to do 80% training, right? For security training for the dev team. What happens if I have 2 claims there? That's not the best scenario for it, because usually there's just like, you either have the training or you don't, right? But if there was another one, I don't know if there's a scenario where that would be the case. I don't know. We definitely thought that we needed multiple claims to be able to support a requirement, because some of them are very generically worded.
Right.
So,
And I think at the time, I think we were envisioning like having the standards and the attestations as one big thing. And I think that would have made sense back then, because again, you could have a claim, for multiple standards. But we've now said that we're going to kind of separate these two things out. I mean, they don't have to be, but they can be.
yeah, but if we're trying to make the standard map accurately to the way that it's actually written in the standard, then the standards are very generically worded, and you will have a requirement that has multiple pieces to it, right? So for example, I'm going through a CASA assessment right now, Cloud Application Security Assessment, and they have a requirement for WAF, right? Like you have to have rate limiting on all your API endpoints. So I would need in this pattern here to supply multiple claims stating that I have basically that WAF rate limiting functionality in place in front of all of my endpoints. I suppose I could make one claim for that and put multiple pieces of evidence in there too, though, to your point. So there's a couple ways that we could slice that, but I'm hesitant because I've seen certain requirements that are very vague.
Right.
NIST is kind of famous for some of that, right? Where there's a requirement, but there's like 5 different pieces wrapped up in one.
Yep. Okay, so we've got 6 minutes left. I think the claims discussion and where, because I don't necessarily like the fact that we basically got 2 different arrays of claims.
Well,
I think we're
this
gonna
one, the
have to-
claims literally map to the requirement. Like that was the idea, was that we're attesting
Right.
to this bundle of claims. And the array down below, right? It's a claim. The one in 70 is a claim ref. The actual claims are only in one place down in 88.
Right.
Are
Yeah.
requirements to claims a one to many relationship only? Or is it many to many?
What's that?
It could
Understand
be
what-
many to many, but that's when you just have another requirement. You can list the claims again. So you could have requirement one. The WAF scenario is a good example of that, right? So you need to rate limit. That's one requirement. Another is you need to scan for cross-site scripting attacks at the WAF, right? That could be another requirement that's backed by the same thing. We do this in our WAF.
Now, if we were to keep this purely a map, wouldn't confidence actually be down here?
I guess the question was, is the confidence meant to be the confidence of the attestation or the confidence of the claim? Because where it is here, it's in the attestation. So how confident are we
Right.
in this statement that we are making?
Well, here's the thing, right? Conformance is also going to be specific to the standard or the requirement.
At that point,
Maybe
I'd say bumping it up into that other section, the map would make more sense. How conformant are we with this particular requirement of the standard? That would make sense. Wouldn't it?
I mean, the conformance is saying that this claim and this evidence conform to this requirement. Right, so I don't think you could move it down to claims. Because it's a relationship between the claim and the requirement, and you're scoring that, correct?
Yeah, so
So
putting
if
it up in 74, basically.
Yes. So if you move it down to
So-
claims, what's the confidence that you're claiming? Is it confidence that we know what we say is correct, or is the confidence that we are meeting the requirement?
Yeah, we're not even talking requirement here. We're making a claim. We are saying that we do this.
I think if we simply, so this thing, we do this. But if we add this up here, this actually now is in relation to the
Requirement.
requirement itself.
Yep.
So
Where it makes sense. And because then in this instance, evidence could also be evidence that you were not compliant 100%.
Right.
Right. That is valid. And that would then back the conformance estimate.
Exactly. Conformance 0.
Yeah. Or, the training documentation, the evidence might actually very much show that you only 80% of your people have gone through it. Right. So this is literally your evidence will back this conformance score. And to your point, your confidence, yes, we're 100% sure. Or we're 80% sure because, we have this other thing that we're aware of that, there's a 30-day limit or there's a 30-day lag or whatever it might be in the reporting.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I think this makes a lot more sense. Kind of moving that one thing up just makes a world of difference.
Yeah.
At least in my mind anyway. Okay. All right. This is looking good. This is looking real good. I'm gonna add I'm gonna add this as a external reference as well. So so that'll be an external reference. So we can just do where's my external references thing? So I'll make this an external reference. We'll get this out in 1.5.
I know we don't have any time left. Where do we fall on in toto predicates or predicates? And trying to get some of that stuff in.
So I thought that the idea was that this whole thing could be an in toto predicate. Like we would be able to wrap this in toto very easily. It's just a JSON object.
Yeah.
And then similarly, we had talked last time about possibly splitting this into two pieces where the requirements were a separate piece and the claims and attestations were their own piece. that would make sense from a publishing and subscribing model. Somebody is
Mhm.
publishing a set of requirements. You are showing you map to them, right? And here's
Mhm.
the evidence of how I map the attestation that I map to those requirements. So that is something that we had talked about. I think there's a lot of value in that, like a tremendous amount of value in that, whether it's an external or an internal one. So I still think that we could have two predicates here, one being these are the requirements, and then, you know, this is the attestations to meet those things. I do think that it's reasonable to have that wrapped up in there, but maintaining this separately, I think, also makes sense.
Yeah. And then what I'm thinking of, and I know we're at time, but what I'm thinking of is kind of keeping these fields, literally just having the enums here, but, you know, have the option to go say subject or subject predicate. You could do one or the other. And if you supply a subject predicate, then obviously you can use the extensibility. If you just supply the subject, then use the existing enums, which are clearly defined. Same thing for type down here, type and type predicate. You do one or the other.
Mhm. Yeah, that helps out a lot. So I guess the where I'm going with this, and I realize we're out of time, is for us internally, we're looking at, you know, attestation registries. And so at some point I can have this body of evidence that I need to like take from this registry over here and try to like smash it into this to try to get it out the door. I guess, at least internally for us, I don't foresee us using like SBOMs directly as the storage of attestation sign off. And so trying to understand the mental map of how I'm going to map those two is helpful.
Yeah. I think, you know, you know, again, I think kind of like SBOM, having standards actually led to the creation of tools and a bunch of ecosystems around that tools. And I
Mhm.
think similar things will probably happen with this, right? Some things are happening like in the Intoto world, but in the general like business world, I think having a centralized way to represent this now will likely lead to the new creation of enterprise level tools that will allow the responsible parties to have workflows between, you know, claims and evidence and sign-offs and everything else. So I think this should hopefully spark the creation of some new tools that will make life for attestations a little bit easier. So hopefully, fingers crossed. All right, gentlemen, thank you so
Cool.
much for your time again, as always. Look forward to next week's conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers.
Sounds
You too.
good. You too. Bye.
All
Talk
right.
to you later.